All right, I'm going to warn y'all, my BS factor isn't quite as high as Chris's, so we'll probably move a little bit faster. My name is Brian Campbell. I'm the livestock specialist at the Southern Piedmont Research Center. My office is right next to Chris. I tell people that he grows the feed and I get to play with the cows. We learned the other week he's not allowed to do that anymore. What I want to talk about tonight is, Chris talked about stockpiling. We're going to go through a few things. We're going to talk about digestion in cattle. We're going to talk about some stockpiling stuff. And then we're going to talk about the times when your stockpiling runs out and you've got to feed hay. So cattle are a wonderful thing, and they let us do a lot of stuff as nutritionists that other people can't get away with, and that's because of the rumen. That fermentation vat covers up for a lot of sins of nutritionists and lets us feed a lot of things to cattle that the people raising chickens or hogs, they just can't do. So it allows us to take a low quality product and turn it into a high quality product. When you start looking at just the basics of digestion, and in people, we require glucose, and that's what all monogastrics require. Ruminants require volatile fatty acids, and it's just a different source of energy. That's all produced in the rumen, and it's thanks to the rumen microbes and the bugs that are in the rumen that allow the cattle to have those. So if we just look at the compartments of the digestive system, and this is really just the compartment or the front part of the stomach, the four-chamber stomach. The reticulum is the first component of it, then the rumen, which is a fermentation vat. And if you look at the rumen on a mature cow, it's about the size of a 55-gallon drum. So we're not talking about any little thing here. The omasum, how many of y'all have ever seen a medicine ball? About the size of a basketball, weighs about 15 pounds. That's the omasum, once you really get into it, and that's just to suck water out so that they don't have to drink as much. And then the abomasum is the true stomach. Once you get past the omasum and into the abomasum, it's just like a monogastric. Behind that, the system is the same as ours. It's the same as a horse's. It's the same as a pig's. So really, if you want to think about cows, it's a big fermentation vat with a pig attached to it. When we just look at it, again, food comes down the esophagus, drops in. The reticulum is right down here in this front part. It's a really thick structure, and all that does is it allows the animal, if it eats something that it shouldn't, how many of y'all know what hardware disease is? If it eats a piece of wire or something, that just holds it, and it's a really thick structure, and that stops it from us having as many issues with hardware disease as we would have otherwise. Again, the rumen's just that big fermentation vat. You get into the omasum, and that just sucks all the water out of the feed, and then you roll on back through the system. When we start trying to design nutritional programs for animals, we want it to be as simple as possible. The less work we've got to do and the more work the animal does, the more money we make. So our nutrition program needs to supply enough nutrients to that cow that we have a strong calf. She can produce the milk, and she maintains enough body condition so that she can get bred back the next year. So when we really start getting into this, most of the year, that cow should be out there grazing, and we shouldn't have to do anything except for let her eat grass. When we get into winter feeding, in this area we really have two options, I guess three options. We have stockpiled tall fescue, which is by far, like Chris said, and I hate to tell Chris he's right, but stockpiled fescue is by far the cheapest way that you can feed cattle in the winter. It's a really high quality feed, and it's really inexpensive. When you start getting into hay, anytime you have to use a machine to feed cows, it gets expensive. There's just no other way to put it. Unfortunately, most of the hay that's produced in Southside Virginia sucks. There's just no other way to put it. I went through last spring before our area beef conference, and I tested hay. I went through about 4 counties, and I just stopped where people were feeding hay, and I pulled hay samples. And I found one example that was really good quality hay. I found a couple examples where they were starving their cows to death. The nutrients were so low in that hay. And it's not that we don't know how to do it. It's just the weather in the springtime when we're making hay. You know, when you're trying to get hay, it either gets rained on a lot or it's over mature before we can cut it. That's just the way our weather works. So most of the time, for us to really get that hay and feed it correctly so that the animals get the nutrients that they need, we're going to have to feed supplements. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that later. So when we look at our cow-calf feeding, forage is our foundation no matter what. You know, if we were in the Midwest, that'd be a little bit different. But around here, forage is the foundation. And our hay has to be, or pasture has to be of adequate quality. Generally, we don't have too many problems with pasture being of adequate quality. Where we run into quality issues is our hay. How many of y'all have seen hay like this? And I know that it's kind of hard to see right there, but that's grass growing on top of those hay bales. If the green stuff on top of your hay is the highest quality part of your hay, there's an issue there. When we're trying to manage for quality, it starts at harvest. You know, we want to harvest it at the optimal quality, but we also want to maximize quantity too. So we start looking at that early boot stage. You know, it's just starting to put that seed head up. That's when we want to cut it. What's the problem with cutting it at that stage around here? It's raining. Trying to find a couple days to get it to dry out without it getting rained on is almost impossible. Forage tests are one of those things that, you know, there's a caveat here. If you're willing to make a change in your feeding program based on what the hay test is, you should test your hay. If you're not going to change anything and you're going to keep doing what you've always done no matter what the hay test says, don't waste your money. If you can store it in a barn or undercover, that's great. You know, hay will stay, if it's in a barn, stored properly and dry, hay will maintain its quality for years and years and years and years and years. You want to get it up off the ground, either on pallets, something so that it's not in contact with the ground, because it'll suck moisture up out of the ground and that'll reduce your quality. Get it covered with a tarp or a barn so you don't have it rained on. And those things we can do to maximize our hay quality. The next time is with our quality is feeding it. You know, we can reduce wastage. We can use a hay ring and reduce wastage. We can roll it out. There are a couple things that we really need to do. That's not the best way to feed hay. It gets the job done, but when you start looking at muddy lots, 4 inches of mud will increase the nutrient requirements of a cow the same as if you added an extra 100 pounds to her. So if you've got a 1,000-pound cow and she's standing in 4 inches of mud, you've got to feed her like she's an 1,100-pound cow. And that's just from the extra energy that she's going to use up trying to get her feet out of that mud. If you can unroll the hay, you know, that spreads out, that does a few things for you. First off, you don't end up with these big muddy spots. You get a better distribution of the nutrients. The few times we've actually had to feed hay at the station, I try and find places with lots of broom straw on them. You know, if we can roll it out there or feed hay there, you put that nutrients down, and broom straw is generally an indicator of low soil fertility. So if we can feed hay in those areas, we boost that soil fertility up and help our pastures out. The other thing is, especially if you've got twine, the plastic stuff, cut those hay strings and get them out of the field. The first time you ever see a cow where it's been wrapped around her leg and the vet's got to go in and cut that stuff out, it's a nasty sight and it's really disgusting and you don't ever want to see it again. So get those hay strings out of there, because once you get them in the ground, I think they reproduce in the ground, because you can pull them off of a farm forever and they just keep coming. When we start looking at our hay, if we need to, we're going to need to supplement some. No matter what, we want to provide mineral for the cattle. We want to base our supplements on the forage test. If we happen to have really good hay one year, or really good hay every year, and we don't need to supplement, there's no point in wasting money putting extra nutrients out there if we don't need it. The most expensive way to fertilize a pasture is to overfeed protein to your cows. There's no more expensive way to put nitrogen fertilizer on your pasture than to feed a 30% protein supplement to cows. Most of the time, our mature brood cows, if they're not milking, we can feed them pretty much anything and they'll survive on it. Where we really need to look at those supplements are animals that are going to need higher nutrients. Our heifers, especially the ones that are our first calf heifers, steers that are growing, and anything in peak lactation. Those are the animals that are really, they've got a high nutrient demand, and that's what we need to work on supplementing. High levels of corn. Corn has always been our standby supplement. Cows need a little something extra, give them some corn. The problem with corn is it's really high in starch. And we talked about those microbes in the gut. There are different bugs that break down starch than break down fiber. So if we start feeding too much corn, putting too much starch in the diet, we're going to shift those bugs over, and then they're not as efficient at breaking down the forages. So one of the things that we don't want to feed too much of is corn. Generally, that works out to be about 5 pounds per day per head or less. When we start looking at feeding hay or feeding or supplementing our hay, there are really about 3 different situations where we need to do it. If our cows, if their hay isn't meeting our performance goals. So if we've got cows that are on hay and they're not growing fast enough, they're not milking enough, we need to supplement. If our forage quality is too low, we need to supplement. Or if we just don't have enough of it. And really and truly, if you have either one of these bottom 2 situations, we're not going to meet our performance goals. So there are some things we can do. If we're not meeting our performance goals, we can add a supplement. And just about anything will work with this. Corn will do it. Generally, with what we see with our forages is we need more energy supplementation than protein supplementation. But what's the first thing you see at the feed store when you go in? On feed. Come on now. Y'all know this. Protein. I've never gone into a feed store and told them that I want a 70% energy feed. I've told them a few times that I want a 16% crude protein feed, and that's how they sell it. If our forage quality isn't high enough, there are some things that we can do and some supplements that we can use. They're called forage-friendly feeds. So when we feed them to the cattle, not only do they get the benefit of that supplement, but we can also improve that animal's ability to break down the forages, those lower quality forages. We can create the rumen environment so that not only do they get that benefit from the extra supplements that we're giving them, but they'll break down our hay better and get more out of it. So some of the things that do that, this is where we get into low starch feeds. Soybean hulls, corn gluten feed, distiller's grains. Whole shell corn doesn't work for that. Wheat midds don't work for that. Anything with high levels of starch won't do that because you're not going to provide that rumen environment. But anything with very low levels of starch will work well for this. Cottonseed hulls, if you're close to a gin, work really well for this. When our forage supplies are limited, if we just don't have enough hay, it gets really big in times of drought. You start looking at hay prices in the middle of a drought, and they're some of the first things that go up. So what we can do now, if we just don't have enough hay, we can put something else out there. Now, again, just about anything will work for this, but if you start looking at different supplements, there's some out there. Again, cottonseed hulls are a great one. They're really big and fluffy. They fill the cow up. She's not going to want to eat as much hay because she's going to be full with something else. If we were further south, rice hulls are a great one. They're not that big and fluffy, but they're really hard to digest. So it's not that the cow's going to fill up as much on them, but she's going to stay full a lot longer once she does fill up. They just don't break down that easily. So there are a couple ways that we can look at these supplements to design something for the cattle so that we can fit whatever situation you need. One of the ones that I'm pretty sure y'all can all tell if you just don't have enough hay. So what we're going to talk about tonight really is when we get into forage quality. So who knows what the definition of forage quality is? Anybody? No, Chris can't answer. Forage quality for what we're going to talk about here tonight is anything in that forage that affects animal performance. Those are really two big things, nutrients and palatability. Nutrients, because the animal has certain requirements, and if we don't meet them, they're not going to perform. And palatability, because you can have the best nutrients on earth, if they don't eat it, it doesn't matter. And what can affect that? The species of the plant has a little bit of effect on nutrients. The maturity of that plant has a lot more impact on the nutrients provided by that plant than the species does. Harvest method, whether we're feeding stockpile fescue or whether we're feeding hay, how well it was harvested, if we got it cut at the right time, if we sat out in the field and got rained on 7 times, all those things have an impact on our nutrients and our quality. And the other one is the storage method. Did we get it in the barn, or did it sit out in the middle of the field and has grass growing on it now? So really, we're trying to balance nutrients here. Cows have a requirement for crude protein and TDN. TDN is total digestible nutrients. That's our energy measurement. And then our forage or our feed has a TDN and a crude protein that's available. If you really want to think about it, the easiest way that I've ever seen it put, TDN works like gas. We need a lot of it. Crude protein works like oil. We don't need nearly as much, but if you don't have it, you're not going to make it very far. When we start looking at just different forages, this is from some data that was done at the Tennessee Forage Hay Testing Lab. This is over 2,000 hay samples. Bermuda grass ranged anywhere from 5.5% crude protein to 24.6% crude protein. And it just goes down. And if you notice, no matter what the forage species is, there's not a big difference in the range or in the mean. This is where we get the fact that some people will badmouth fescue because the nutrients aren't very good, or they'll say orchard grass is a whole lot better. When you really get down to it, species doesn't really matter that much. There are a whole lot of other things that matter more, like maturity and storage, than will ever matter. Than species will ever make a difference in it. You get the same thing in TDN, big range in all of them, but there's a whole lot more difference within a species than there is between species. So, when I was at Tennessee, one of the things that the local co-op did was they started this program called PEP, and it was Provide Extra Protein. And the dean came into my boss one day and he said, well, do we need to support this, or do we need to do something else? And my boss came up with this wonderful slogan, and he sent it back to the dean, and it was, protein is sufficiently supplied on fescue forage. Well, if y'all read that, the dean was not very happy with us, which is probably why he's no longer at the University of Tennessee either. But what I really want to push with this is, if you look at most of our forages in this part of the world, good quality fescue hay is going to run anywhere from 12 to 16% crude protein. Our pastures, stockpile fescue probably averages close to 14-15% crude protein. I've pulled fescue samples of actively growing forages that hit 26% crude protein. We don't have the issues with protein that we see further west in this country. Most of the time, TDN or energy is going to limit our animals' performance long before protein ever does. Yeah, there are some instances where it's flipped, but 90% of the time, energy is going to limit animals' performance before protein ever gets a chance to. So supplementation. What are we going to supplement with? We'll talk some more about this, but corn, again, that's the one that's always been big. It's what we always used because it was cheap. And it's getting back to be that way now. I like corn prices right now. Corn prices are low, cattle prices are high. It's a wonderful situation. Soybean hulls. Now, soybean hulls are that outer seed coat from the soybean. They weren't available for a long time because when we were exporting soybean meal, Europe wanted a lower protein content than what we were using in the United States, so they were adding the soybean hulls into it to drop that protein content. Now Europe is okay with higher protein content soybean meal, so we have hulls available. Corn gluten feed, so what's left over after they make high fructose corn syrup. So as long as Taylor likes drinking Sundrop, we're gonna have corn gluten feed. And then dry distillers grains. And dry distillers grains have been produced in this country for a long time, and they're not going away. So corn, when we just look at the nutrients available in corn, 7% crude protein, 90% TDN, really high in energy. This is the energy feed that all other energy feeds are based on. And while I'm on this, I got a call the other day from a producer who asked me about this magic feed that had 10 times the energy content of corn. I really want to see a feed that has 480% energy. It doesn't happen. When we start feeding animals, we always talk about a percent basis, but animals eat pounds. They don't eat percents. And we hit a max of 100% in just about everything that we do. It's one of those mathematical things. It's hard to get above 100%. So if you have somebody who's trying to sell you a feed or sell you a product and it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So when we start feeding corn, again, 5 pounds per head per day is an easy rule to follow. We don't want to put too much starch in that rumen and reduce that animal's ability to digest fibers, because that's going to reduce their utilization of our pastures. Soybean hulls. This is that outside seed coat. It runs anywhere from 12 to 14% crude protein. It tests at anywhere from 75 to 80% or TDN. It feeds closer to 90%. And what this is you remember earlier I talked about that forage-friendly fiber? This is a really, really highly digestible fiber source. And so when we feed it to animals that are on a pasture or a hay-based diet, that forage-based diet, they're actually able to utilize more of the nutrients in that hay or in that pasture than they would be able to without being fed this. So that's why you get that bump in performance. So not only are you going to get the supplement, but you're also going to better utilize the other stuff that they're eating. So we see a higher feeding value of this than what it tests. It's really highly palatable. Generally, it's going to be pelleted, and that's more of a transportation. These are really light and fluffy, and if they're not pelleted, when you start trying to move them around the farm, if you're feeding on a large scale, put them in the bucket of the tractor and try and drive across the field, they're all going to blow out. So that's why they're pelleted. The other thing is just transportation. When you start looking at a 5-gallon bucket of unpelleted soybean hulls weighs about 10 pounds. Pelleted weighs closer to 25. It just compacts them down, allows you to put more in there, and that's important for transportation if you're trying to fill up a truckload of them or a rail car. Corn gluten feed, 25.5% crude protein on average, and 83% TDN. I say on average because these are very variable feeds. They're a byproduct. That's what's left over after they make high fructose corn syrup. So the companies that make them care about making high quality, high fructose corn syrup. They don't really care about whether or not they make high quality corn gluten feed. So there's tons of load to load variation. There's plant to plant variation, and there's day to day variation within each plant. I wouldn't want corn gluten feed that's made early on Monday morning or late on Friday afternoon. It's just like anything else. Everybody wants to get off of work, and it's not going to be as good. If they dry it down too fast, it'll denature the proteins and they won't be available. If they dry it too hot, it'll do the same thing. So there's a lot of differences within these feeds. So you've got to be careful and understand that just because the book says it's 25.5% crude protein, some days you might get it and it's 12% crude protein, and some days you might get it and it's 36% crude protein. Very variable, and there's some mineral issues associated with this. It's very high in phosphorus and very low in calcium. If you're feeding high quantities of it and you don't fix that issue, it causes what's known as urinary calculi. It's like kidney stones for cows. And I've never had kidney stones. I've heard people talk about them, and I don't ever want to. I've seen cattle that are on corn gluten feed, and we walked around the feed yard, and you could see the crystals forming on the belly hairs of the sheath because they were putting out crystals, those crystalline structures so much because they were feeding really high levels of this stuff, and the guy couldn't figure out why they were going off feed. The other one is it's really high in sulfur, and that can create a ton of mineral issues. One of the big ones is polioencephalomalacia. It's also called waterhead. If you see your cow start acting like goats, you know you've got an issue. And what happens is it causes swelling on the brain, and the cows will go up to fence posts or trees, and they'll just put their head against them and start pushing, because that reduces the pressure on their brains. It'll kill them. So cows acting like goats is a bad thing for more than just because it messes up your fences. Dry distillers grains. Distillers grains were made in this country a long time ago. Jack Daniels makes some good ones. And if you can, if you can get distillers grains from a human ethanol plant like Jack Daniels or Jim Beam, you're going to get higher quality distillers grains than if you get it from an ethanol plant that's making fuel ethanol. And there are a couple reasons for that. One of them is because those plants like Jack Daniels have to use food grade corn. Fuel ethanol plants can buy whatever grain or corn source they want. It doesn't have to be tested for any sort of toxins. They don't have to worry about it. They can take the cheapest stuff they can find and make ethanol out of it. Where if you start dealing with Jack Daniels or Jim Beam, they have to use high quality corn. And if you start with high quality, you're going to get out higher quality at the end. Distillers grains runs 29.5% crude protein. Again, that's an average. It's going to be very dependent upon everything that was just like corn gluten feed. Day of the week, plant, 87% TDN. It's very variable. It's still made from corn. It's got the same mineral issues that corn had. Now, the other thing with distillers grains, with the increase in the fuel ethanol plants, we can now get distillers grains from milo. We can get distillers grains from wheat. So just because you're getting distillers grains, you've got to make sure it's corn distillers grains. If the plant happened to be using something else, make sure you know that. Generally what we see is corn distillers grains though. Issues with supplementation of these. Again, minerals, high phosphorus, low calcium. Just about any grain is going to be high in phosphorus and low in calcium. High sulfur. The other thing with any of these supplements is when we're figuring in costs, we've got to figure in the cost of feeding them, of storing them, and of spoilage. I called today and I got prices of some of these feeds delivered to the research center in Blackstone. When I called today, corn, I was told to get it delivered, was going to be $5.50 a bushel. And I'm sure if you talk to a farmer, you can probably get it cheaper than that. That's going through a feed dealer. They got to have their markup on it. That worked out to be $196 a ton. I could get soybean hulls for $190 a ton. They offered me gluten feed in two different forms. Pelleted was $190 a ton, and loose was $160 a ton. And then dry distillers grains, this was loose, was $150 a ton. When I'm trying to figure out what the best deal is, I always figure out the price per pound of nutrient. All right, this gets back to not feeding something you don't need. If I'm trying to boost energy up in a cow for that feed, I don't need to jack the protein up. If I can feed her an energy source without jacking the protein up, generally I can get away with it cheaper. When we look at crude protein, corn runs about 7% crude protein. It was the most expensive feed today. So that's $1.40 for every pound of crude protein. And distillers grains, I can get that for 25 cents a pound. So which one would y'all like to feed? It's pretty simple. Feed the cheap one. Broke down the same, well, sort of the same way. There's a lot less difference when we got into the pound per pound of crude of TDN. Corn was 10 cents a pound. Soybean hulls were 12 cents. Now, I'm going to tell you, that's based on the tested value, not what it actually feeds. So that's a little bit off there. Distillers grains was still the cheapest one. So if we're looking at supplement with prices that we can get today or that I got today, I'd feed distillers grains because that's by far the cheapest nutrient source that I can get. Tall fescue hay. I called around today, and if we just look at average tall fescue hay, 13% crude protein, 55% TDN. That's going to meet the needs of our mature brood cows. It's going to meet the requirements of a cow that's not milking too high. It's not quite going to meet what we need for heifers. It's not going to meet what we need for steers. So that's going to need to be supplemented. But I called around and I figured out if you compare these to what those numbers are, if you go back and you compare them to distillers grains, with this hay, you've got to be able to buy the hay for $65 a ton to meet the same price of distillers grains at $150 a ton, because that distillers grains is providing you with so much more crude protein. If you need energy, you can pay $99 a ton for the hay. Otherwise, it's cheaper to get distillers grains. So when we start looking at this, we don't want to just go out and buy hay or produce hay because we think that's what's going to be the cheapest. We really need to look at it. I called around today and went on the Hay Clearing House and on Craigslist and a few other places, and I found hay selling from anywhere from $75 to $200 a ton. Well, if you can buy hay for $75 a ton, you're doing pretty well. If I've got to buy it at $200 a ton, there are some other sources that I can use that save me money. And like Chris said, producing hay is $120 a ton. There are other sources that you can use to feed cattle cheaper than just making hay. And I know therapeutic tractor driving is important, but it is expensive. Stockpile tall fescue. Stockpiled fescue averages 15% crude protein and 63% TDN. So for us to meet the same nutrients, the cost per pound of nutrients in stockpiled fescue as distillers grains, I need to get $75 a ton is my break-even price on stockpile for crude protein and $113 for TDN. How much does it cost you to produce a ton of stockpiled fescue? Well, according to Virginia Tech's estimates, which figure in absolutely everything, including feeding, stockpiled fescue should cost you about $50 a ton. There's no cheaper source for feeding cattle during the winter than stockpiled fescue. That's the way it works. So if you can stockpile fescue, go for it. And if you can't do it, call Chris and he'll help you get it set up. Just some take-home messages. No matter what you're doing, consider all the costs. There are always hidden costs associated with it, whether it's delivery charges on the feed, whether it's feeding it, whether it's wastage. Make sure you figure in all the costs. Make sure it fits your program. If you don't need to feed extra protein, don't feed extra protein. If you don't need extra energy, don't feed extra energy. Because my neighbor's doing it is not a good reason to feed something. And I promise y'all that I've heard that excuse for why people were feeding something more than once. Stockpiling is the lowest cost option by far. And when we get into hay, sometimes it's a good option and sometimes it's not. I really and truly believe that I can buy hay cheaper than I can produce it any day of the week and feed a supplement to boost it up to whatever I need to and still come out ahead economically rather than making hay. Any questions?
You help yourself on stockpile fescue, feeding a little hay, and make the stockpile fescue last a little longer.
You could. That's going to be one of those things where if you've got good stockpile, I think you're going to have trouble making the cows eat the hay. I think even if you have bad stockpile, I think your issue there, it'll stretch it out, but I think you're going to have issues. If you've got stockpile out there, I think they're going to eat stockpile first before they eat the hay.
See, hay around here that's 50% broom straw.
Yes. And I will tell you, if you're feeding the 50% broom straw hay, your cows will starve to death with a full stomach. The base requirement for cows to survive is 7% crude protein. If there's less than 7% crude protein in the diet, that's not enough to support the rumen microbes. And once the rumen microbes die, I don't care how full she is, she's not going to live long.
And there has been some cows already that it is suspected that they've already died of that.
I've had 2 calls in the past year where somebody's cows were dying and they couldn't figure out why. And the first one, the guy was new at farming, and he'd figured out that if you've got 100 cows, 1 round bale a week is not sufficient to keep them fed. And the second one, he'd lost 3 cows because he was feeding hay that was so low in crude protein that they were starving to death with a full stomach. Just because the feed's out there doesn't mean it's going to meet their requirements, and it is totally possible to starve an animal to death with a full stomach.
I got a question on stockpile. If your entire summer pasture was stockpile, how long is it going to last?
It depends. I can't get it. It's going to depend on how many cows you have eating it, on how much pasture you have, on how much rain fell. Just in looking,
How you graze.
Yeah, we did a study last year at the station, and comparing it to this year. We're repeating it this year, and our stockpile numbers just on tons per acre is up by probably 700 pounds of stockpile per acre. So it really depends.